Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. The recent talks in Mar-a-Lago led to some cautious optimism on ending the war in Ukraine, but also to mixed signals, exacerbated by Russia's efforts to divert attention with the story of Ukrainian drone attack on Putin's mansion. But even as the CIA begins to unravel Moscow's narrative, doubts remain as to how to conclude what might be a European security milestone of a deal, if done right, that is. Between vague security guarantees, Russian meddling and questions over Kremlin's frozen funds, is this still a story of one step forward and two steps back, with the peace talks, with Moscow doing most of the backtracking? Joining us now is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning and thank you for inviting me.
The President Volodymyr Zelensky said it's all about the 10% of what has not been agreed yet, but this is also the most difficult part. What do you think is going to happen next? Are we going to arrive at 100%, or is Russia going to throw a spanner in the works once again?
I have to disappoint your viewers and tell you that there is no peace process. Everybody is going through and pretending there is a peace process. The Russians are pretending, the Europeans are pretending, and the Ukrainians are pretending. This is a merry-go-round. We start with Russian proposals, then rehashed by the Trump administration, Ukraine, and then Europe says no. They prepare new proposals, and then the Russians say no to these, and then we start again. The gulf between the Ukrainian-European position and the Russian position is massive. And it's over key questions such as territory and Ukraine sovereignty. For example, you mentioned security guarantees. You know, there have been so many definitions of these. It's difficult to know which ones we're talking about. But most importantly, Russia refuses to support any security guarantees for Ukraine. And Russia opposes the sending of European troops into Ukraine. It says these will be classified as NATO troops and they will be a target for Russian attacks. So I think that there has been practically no progress. President Zelensky, when he talks about 90%, he has to be diplomatic. Nobody wants to anger Donald Trump, neither the Europeans or the Ukrainians, because we know that he's very vindictive.
So if the peace process is a bit of a sham, as you're saying, then don't the Europeans and the Americans realize this? Because we can see that Russia is at the center of the problem, right? With its very extreme demands, with its unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. Does that mean that everyone is going through the motions only to essentially say, well, we did our best, nothing worked, Russia still doesn't want to play ball, so we're back to square one? Is that what we're going to see?
Well, the Europeans do recognize this, that of course the main problem is Russia, particularly the Europeans who are the closest to Russia. The West Europeans finally, the French and Germans finally began to take on the same position as the Central East Europeans. But I don't believe that the Trump administration believes this. The Trump administration throughout 2025 has tried to pressure Ukraine to accept the Russian position. The Trump administration has refused to apply a range of pressure, economic, energy, or military, on Vladimir Putin to try to force him to moderate his maximalist demands. The Trump administration hasn't done that. In fact, there have been some recent very brutal leaks about how Donald Trump is basically telling the Ukrainians, accept what's on the table, really in a very undiplomatic manner. There's zero respect from the Trump administration to the Ukrainians. When President Zelensky arrived in Florida a few days ago, there was no state officials to meet Zelensky. It was a complete shambolic, disrespectful towards Ukraine. The main negotiator, Mr. Steve Witkoff, has been 6 times to Moscow, never once to to Kiev. Are we surprised the Ukrainians do not trust the Trump administration on security guarantees? The Europeans, of course, are hoping and praying that eventually Donald Trump will come to realize that the Russians are stalling, the Russians don't want peace, and they're trying to pull the wool over his eyes. But Trump keeps believing Vladimir Putin, the biggest liar in the world. For example, over this fake Ukrainian attack on Vladimir Putin.
But now he also said, he initially said that it might have happened, it might have not, but then he actually reposted an article from the New York Post which openly says this was a lie, there was no attack, and Putin is actually derailing the peace process. Do you think this could be a signal of some sort of major change, or merely, the pendulum swinging back and forth, so to say?
Well, we've had high hopes throughout 2025 that Trump finally understands what's going on. And we've always been disappointed. So I'm not very hopeful, to be quite honest. I mean, after all, Donald Trump has a record going back to his first presidency, back in, I think it was 2019, where at the Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin, he openly said he trusted Vladimir Putin more than he trusted the American intelligence agencies. And this still seems to be the true today. So it's difficult to understand. I mean, Donald Trump's primary motivation is to get the Nobel Peace Prize. He doesn't give a damn about Ukraine. He doesn't give a damn about the Ukrainian people. And let's understand, he's a Brexiteer. So he's very hostile to the European Union. So he doesn't care and doesn't respect the European Union either. So I think all of these factors have to be taken into account. Europeans are still hopeful. Very few Ukrainians. I mean, in Ukraine, opinion polls show very big decline in Ukrainian trust in the Americans. Let's remember the Ukrainians have been stung by the Americans already once. They signed up to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, security guarantees in return for giving up the world's third largest nuclear weapons. And in 2014, not a Republican, but a Democrat, President Barack Obama, betrayed Ukraine. They completely ignored those security guarantees. So the Ukrainians are demanding that the US Congress both houses legally ratify any security guarantees because they do not trust Donald Trump.
So whatever happens when it comes to the decisions, of the U.S. administration, we've already, delineated the possibility that the peace process could actually grind to a better halt. Let's examine this scenario. What happens then? Let's assume that Donald Trump and the European stakeholders in this say it has not been possible to agree on any sort of deal. Moscow kept derailing this process, kept dragging their feet. What happens next? Can Ukraine survive this? What would be the ultimate result of such a scenario, whereby Ukraine keeps fighting? And who would support them in this fight?
Well, the Ukrainians, unlike the Palestinians, who have been betrayed by all their Arab neighbors, Ukrainians have European backing. Europeans, and here I talk about the EU, Norway, and Britain together, all recognize how Ukraine's fight is in their national interests. So in that sense, they, plus the Canadians, let's not forget the Canadians, will continue to strongly support Ukraine financially, economically, and militarily.
Wouldn't European unity be a problem, if I may ask? Because we have Hungary, we have Slovakia, we also have the situation with Belgium and the frozen Russian assets. And then there is the lack of parity when it comes to spending. Baltic states, Nordic states, Poland, they spend much more than countries like Spain, for example. So do you think that a basic rethinking of how this unity and how its support is supposed to work would be necessary before moving forward?
Well, the European Union, being a very clever institution, can always find ways round various problems like Mr. Orban in Hungary, and they managed to get round Hungarian veto and provide Ukraine with 2 years funding, despite Mr. Orban and despite the Belgian Prime Minister. So I don't think that's an issue. I mean, this is a big burden for the Europeans and Canadians because the Americans, Donald Trump administration, we keep worrying what will happen about Donald Trump if he stops supporting the Trump administration stopped supporting Ukraine a year ago.
But they are selling weapons. Would they stop selling weapons?
They're selling, they're not giving weapons. And Trump will never stop that because this is big money for American, large American military contractors. And Trump will never oppose that. They want the Europeans to continue to be reliant on American weapons. So that I don't think is a problem. On the intelligence side, that's always the big question. But we heard just a few days ago that the CIA is actually providing intelligence to the Ukrainians to give them the possibility of attacking Russian refineries. So it seems that the American intelligence community sees a different views the war in a different way to Donald Trump and his administration. So I'm not so worried because I think that, as I mentioned earlier, finally the French, Germans, and West Europeans have come to realize about the Russian threat, which the East Europeans and the Scandinavians have been talking about for a long time. As for military spending, of course, that's always going to be varied throughout Europe, and Poland is going to be the highest military spender, maybe with Finland and some Baltic states. That, I think, is always going to be varied. I mean, I'm half Italian. My mother's Italian. Italy is at the bottom of the European military spending. So I think that is going to be always the case. I don't think these three countries, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, are going to be major problems in providing sort of money or military aid. Again, let's remember, 50% or half of what Ukraine uses in military equipment is made inside Ukraine. So this is a very different picture to 4 years ago. So yes, Ukraine will be able to continue fighting. I think this peace process will keep doing merry-go-rounds. We'll start again. It'll fail again. I think this will continue until potentially a positive scenario where President Trump finally realizes Putin is trying to hoodwink him. Putin is not serious. Maybe that will.
Putin has never been serious about this process from the start, some would say. Professor Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.